The strike, who's leading it? Who's find someone, execute them, and the strike will go away. Now this was the feeling about the slave revolt, and they were right in a way that Toussaint Louverture was the most remarkable person, but of course he was not the slave revolt. The slave revolt, the slogan of the slave revolt was liberty or death, which was exactly the position they were in. They either got rid of slavery or they died. And that was the strength of the slave revolt from the very first moment that it started to be organized. I was born into a liberal Methodist tradition. I was brought up simply to believe that people should tell the truth, as most Christians, I suppose, are brought up. And I've been surprised over 34 years now as a professional journalist to discover, well, first of all, that I think most people do tell the truth most of the time. Most people do, because most people haven't got a lot to hide. That is, people who haven't got very much money, for instance, which is most people. On the other hand, the thing that surprised me was not that so much as the fact that the people at the top of the society, the people in charge of the society, in every sphere of the society in which they were in charge, seemed to me consistently and relentlessly to tell lies.
The inquiry into Stephen Lawrence, which I've attended for some days, has exposed, not as they would wish us to believe, the incompetence of the police. What it has exposed is the mixture of racialism and corruption, which, although we all knew that there was racialism and corruption in the Metropolitan Police, we never believed, even the most ardent of us would never have believed that this would amount to such a peak that it would allow racist murderers of a black student to go free. But that is the truth of the story of Stephen Lawrence.
And his final cry, of course, rise like lions after slumber, and his assurance to people that they were going to win the oppressed people because, after all, ye are many, they are few, is something which has been taken up by radicals and reformers and revolutionaries ever since. It was taken up by the Chartists, by the early socialists, by the women's suffragists, by Mahatma Gandhi in South Africa, and even in 1989 in Tiananmen Square when the students stood against their oppressors in China. It was translated into Chinese, rise like lions after slumber. It's a notion, together with a whole poem, which has inspired radicals and revolutionaries in 170-odd years since it was written, and it continues to inspire us today.
Men make their own history, and so, by the way, do women. And however much the objective conditions may be for giving the vote or advancing one section of the working class or another section, however strong the argument is, unless people do something about it, unless they agitate, and surely this is absolutely central to everything that we stand for, unless they actually agitate and demonstrate and protest and chain themselves to railings and interrupt liberal ministers and all the other things, then these things won't come about. And so, I conclude without any doubt at all that this victory would not have been won had it not been for the agitation for the franchise, for all the suffragettes, all the sections, even going back to the constitutional suffragists, to all the people who ever raised this argument, took part in this argument, yes, and to all the Pankhursts as well. It's to all those people, all those many, many hundreds of thousands of people, mostly women, who took this fight on, and won it.
So again, he was lit up by what happened in France. And he came back from France, took a little room in a pub in Islington, at the Angel Islington, went upstairs, ordered about 15 bottles of whiskey, sat down and wrote for day after day after day. And he wrote then this book, The Rights of Man. And he wrote it in direct answer to Burke. It is one of the greatest books in our history.
By far the best book about this question is the one that is called The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, the man responsible for getting Frank Worrell captain of the West Indies cricket team. I tried to think of something more important about him to say. I mean, he was a Trotskyist for many years, but he did actually achieve in West Indian cricket the rights of the blacks to control their old cricket, and anyone who's interested in that, C.L.R. James is the most magnificent writer, and this book, which comes out in the late 30s, C.L.R. James from the Trotskyist tradition, writing a book about the mingling of the two revolutions. Anybody who hasn't read that really has to testify to the Almighty in some way or other.
I bought this pamphlet nearly 40 years ago at Clyde Books at Anderston Cross in Glasgow. It's not there anymore in case there's any Glasgow people here, but you walked up from the Daily Record where I worked there in Hope Street, and you walked up every Friday night to Clyde Books, every Friday afternoon to Clyde Books to get the latest communist literature, socialist literature. And I bought this little book, Civil War in France, as a special edition actually produced in 1921 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Commune. I bought this book and I got on the bus to go home, and I read some of it on the bus, and then I got off the bus and I was walking, reading it as I went home, stumbling into people, talking to people, shouting at people as I went along, went home and read it for the most, finished it, I don't know, that night. And in one blow, this book smashed all my exciting parliamentary ambitions.
Thou hast left behind powers that will work for thee, air, earth, and skies. There's not a breathing of the common wind that will forget thee. That's what we think about Paul. There's not a breathing of the common wind that will forget thee.
That was Michael Foot at Our Left Foot in 2004, the big event we had in the Hackney Empire just after Paul had died. This meeting is to remember Paul, who died 10 years ago. He last spoke in this room at the end of Marxism, or during Marxism 2004. And we're here to celebrate Paul, to celebrate a great journalist, a writer, a revolutionary socialist, an all-round agitator, someone who called himself a feminist and an anti-racist, someone whose starting point was a profound interest in ordinary people, someone who could explain the most complex ideas in very simple language and could write in the same way. Paul joined the International Socialists in 1963 when it had about 50 members. So he didn't join it because it was a big organisation. He joined it because he thought it had interesting political ideas, and he argued those ideas for the rest of his life. Now, this meeting is going to be slightly different from the other meetings we have at Marxism. It's more of a conversation. We have a panel of speakers, but I've also got a lot of people in the hall who want to speak, and I will call them to speak. I've talked to a lot of them over the last couple of weeks. So I also want to, welcome to all of those additional speakers, and also welcome to all the members of Paul's family who are here. There's a number of them. And before we start, a huge thanks to John Houston for putting this trailer, the pictures and so on together. We'll try and get the technicals sorted out, and we'll play it again at the end of the meeting if you want to hear some of those excerpts from Paul. Could you make sure your mobile phones are off? And the film will be recorded, so anybody who doesn't want to be filmed, just indicate to the camera person who's sitting down the front here. I'm going to introduce the four speakers first, and then we're going to get going. John Pilger joined the Daily Mirror in the 1960s and left, as we say, in the 1980s, once Robert Maxwell had arrived. Paul joined the Daily Mirror in the 1980s, and he left when David Montgomery arrived. And John left print journalism to become, one of our best documentary and most brilliant documentary filmmakers. Darcus Howe, now I learnt this only last week. Darcus, I can't talk about Darcus without talking about cricket. you may have seen on the screen one of Paul's favourite books, one of the books that he talked about so much was The Black Jacobins. The Black Jacobins, the story of the Haiti slave revolt and Toussaint Louverture, was written by C.L.R. James. And C.L.R. James is Darcus Howe's uncle, was Darcus Howe's uncle. C.L.R. James also wrote another famous book about cricket, Beyond the Boundary. And if those of you, there'll be a bit of cricket in this meeting, I think. It'll come up more than once. And if you caught the photographs at the beginning when it was all a bit sort of, as I say, we'll run it again at the end, there was a photograph of Paul on parade when he was doing his national service, and he was on parade in Jamaica. And Darcus says he thinks that posting to Jamaica had a profound effect upon Paul. Gareth Peirce, many of you will know from all the political cases that she does as a solicitor. She's based in London. And I remember going to her office in the 1980s and seeing all these files with all these Irish names down the spines. And then I remember going to her office in the 2000s and seeing all these Muslim names down the spines. And it tells you a lot about the... But appropriate to this meeting, Gareth tells me she first met Paul during the 1984 miners' strike, which is another topic will come up. Matt is Paul Foot's middle son. Like his father and his grandfather, he studied law, but unlike his father, who gave it up even before he left Oxford and stopped studying it, Matt stuck with it and is a solicitor in London. Now, I'm going to ask John Pilger to start, because let's start with Paul's journalism. And over to you, John.
I just can't believe it's 10 years. I was filming when I heard that Paul had died, and it was something I and so many of us felt so deeply because of the loss of such a humble human being. I come back to that word. Paul had so many achievements. He was such a, to use that terrible cliche, a kind of larger-than-life character in some ways, but he was also self-effacing and humble. He spanned, as we all know, all the classes in this country, and he used to make fun of this himself a lot. And it was interesting, quite instructive when he died, that a number of people, and Paul had this very wide circle of friends, but the one thing about Paul with his wide circle of friends was that his principles and politics were never, ever compromised. They always belonged with Paul and his socialism. But when he died, there are a number of people who probably weren't really friends, but they're in that certain wide circle, who wrote or commented that Paul had been a brilliant journalist in spite of his socialism. The point was, and these were, interestingly, these were not really conservatives, as I remember, who said that. They were that group we know as liberals. It's a big group, and it's fairly flexible, but you know what I mean. Blairites and people like that. And of course, Paul was, the thing about Paul that was so wonderful was that he was such a brilliant journalist largely because of his socialism. And by socialism, by his socialism, I mean, just interpreting that a little, because he saw journalism combining the principles of the betterment of society, of all peoples, of social justice, and of rights for all. He saw that as utterly compatible, that socialism, that revolutionary socialism, with journalism. In fact, it's almost a definition of the best of journalism. Not for Paul, the kind of corporate BBC journalism that allegedly balances, that is, balancing stereotypes in order to disguise itself as a voice of power. Paul was above all a voice of people. He understood about the powerful, and maybe having come from among them, that helped. He understood about them. He understood about those in so-called public life. Paul could do wonderful mimicry, which I almost feel, having had so much on the phone with him, hearing him, I can still hear him. I almost moved to try and mimic him, which I won't do. But he understood what the great American comedian Larry David described as the babbling brook of bullshit, and that runs right through all those up the top. He understood that very well. And he drew from that this wonderful black sense of humour and irony. So he was both. He was a great socialist and a great journalist and a very good human being in every way I can think of. I will probably go on to discuss his achievements. I just mentioned one for me always. Lockerbie was Paul's beacon. His great achievement was just a few years ago in Scotland that when el-Megrahi, the Libyan alleged culprit of Lockerbie, one of two, was sent back. He was sent back on a deal. He was sent back. His release was on condition that he would drop his appeal, because they knew that in that appeal would be finally enough evidence for the truth. No one in this country in authority has ever had the guts to say that. And I make that point because Paul Foote had all of that many years before. And if you want a sense, just a sense, a smell of Paul's great work, download from Private Eye, it costs about a £5, his wonderful Lockerbie issue expose. Thank you.
As John has mentioned Lockerbie, can I just read this out? Because Pam Dix, whose brother died in the Lockerbie bombing, did hope to be here today, but she couldn't come. So she wrote to us, "I'm really sorry I can't be there. I have been remembering the first time I stood in front of Paul at his desk at the Mirror asking for help, a request that he leapt up to respond to in the most positive way. The profound sense of loss that I felt when I discovered he had died has settled into a sort of nagging awareness of an empty space that he used to fill, which no one else could." That was Pam Dix. Now, to change the tone a bit, let's ask Darcus, because I've said something about Paul. You know, I've mentioned his anti-racism and also that experience in Jamaica. So, Darcus Howe.
Thank you, Matt, for inviting me to speak of a quite honorable gentleman. A lot of people wouldn't think he was. At times he didn't behave as though he was a wonderful man, and he left us on a day of doubt. No longer his sun sharp answers to break the clouds. That was Paul. I missed him in that kind of way. that he lost something in a huge struggle that we were going uphill with. And the moment that shaped him and myself at the same time in history was the anti-colonial movement that wanted Britain to get out of our countries, France out of our countries. And Paul was part of a vanguard of so many of us young people in the Caribbean. And I'll come and tell you something, and you may think I'm bad. Paul was a West Indian. I'm not joking. And so that period in human history, after the Second World War, and millions of people, India, Pakistan, Ghana, Nigeria, all of the Caribbean, East Africa, West Africa, Paul and I were close up inside it and took a clean and clear position that we should be made independent, and we were advanced enough to govern ourselves, not what a lot of people in the colonial office were saying, who perhaps he went to school with, that we weren't advanced enough and more intelligent enough to govern ourselves. And it came from the mouth of people who in years immediately before killed 45 million of people between 1938 and 1945, and wanted to see those who demanding independence were too barbaric after you already killed 45 million people. And Paul and I shared that, and we laughed away. And Paul was a Jamaican. He was, if he wasn't, something else had taken place for him to wear Jamaica's military outfit and join the army to do the 2 years you had was compulsory at certain ages. Paul could have left his father, who was the governor of Jamaica, and come back to England to join the army and do his compulsory 2 years. He stayed in the Jamaican barracks, and he became a military man in the Jamaican army. I thought, when he first told me that, I said, that couldn't possibly be true. How do you go into barracks, leaving the government house where his father sat and where there was a sentry with guns, and if you pass that there, the sentry would say, who goes there? And you had to say, so, and Paul left that, and he had to have a kind of gravitas and a non-prejudice of class to sit in a barracks with Jamaicans. And I think there he learned the Jamaican vernacular, because Paul would just rattle you and say, away one, sir. I looked, this is a white man sitting down next to me, with the blood clot here, say, sir. Paul. And he took it in his stride. He was for independence. And his parents, his father, was on the side of the independence movement, but couldn't carry that inside the colonial office. He probably would have been sent to Venezuela or something to be a diplomat. And we came out, and Paul knew West Indians. And I knew him through his surname, Foot. And the Jamaicans drew so closely to the Foot family. They used to say, Governor Foot and his little feet. Paul was one of the feet. I don't know if it was left or right or whatever. And that was a statement of affection. And it will give you some indication that he came from a family that was liberal with a small L. You know, the Liberal Party. They were egalitarian. His spirit was one of human beings are equal. He learned that as a child. He didn't learn that because he wanted to be a Marxist-Leninist. That was in his DNA. And I was around campaigning in the black movement against the police. So I go to Lord's, and I'm sitting down with a Jamaican crowd, 90% of whom were smoking ganja. And we all came, there was a young Jamaican called Lawrence Rowe, Yaga Rowe, one of the finest batsmen, including Don Bradman, including Peter May, that I had ever seen, and Paul. And Paul was on the case. He said, this is it. He got so excited, I thought he was born in Kingston. Born Jamaican, Paul was. He says, could you get some of that weed? I wouldn't even look at him. I said, no. And I come also to send my mom, who took me to my first test match, some pieces of turf in an envelope to say I went to Lord's. When I left Trinidad, all my mother wanted from me was when I get there, go to Lord's, steal some grass, put it in an envelope, and send it for her. I said, Pablo Cito, you're a white fellow, see if you can do that for me. And he got the glass, I put it in the grass, I put it in my pocket, and off he went. And that began a political relationship.
Darcus, I'll come back to you. But
No, you didn't cut anybody. I have 2 more lines to say. Don't stop the rhythm. He had children, I had children. And this has happened long before. I go to my daughter's school, Beckford Primary School, is it not, in West Hampstead. And there was Matfoot. I said, who is he? He was chatting up my daughter, so I said. And I asked my daughter, Tamara, who is he? She said, that's Matfoot. I said, Foot? Find out who is his father. And then she came the next day and said, Dad, his father knows you, and his mom, and they. Then they left there. No public school. It didn't even cross his mind, I thought. And he went to Hampstead Comprehensive, didn't you all? No, don't look askance, because it wasn't in Hampstead at all. It was in Cricklewood. And the students were Irish immigrants and West Indian immigrants. And in the first year, there was Paul Gilroy. You remember Paul Gilroy? His mom was head teacher of the school, the first half of the primary. And she told me, Darcus, have you spoken to the father? I said, about what? She says, you all need to watch that principal. We got there in that first few years. She doesn't like anybody who's radical or black. It's okay. And here, this one here, and Tamara became friends. To this day. She's not in here, but I told her, you have to come because Matt is going to be there. They were children together. That shows you the durability of relationships with the little feet. And I accepted to come here, and I lightened the moment. I tried to, but it was a huge loss of a friend and a comrade. And we had to obey the weight of that satire. I'll speak what I feel, not what I want to say. The oldest has born more. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live as long as Pablo Cito. Thank you for asking me to speak. Thank you for
Gareth.
My friendship, comradeship with Paul came about only because I had innumerable tales of misfortune to tell him. He was intimidating to me. He was, I had such knowledge of him before I met him, such admiration for him, thought he was so extraordinary that I was frightened when I went to see him first, which was 30 years ago. having come from a particular mining village in the north called Blidworth. And there had been a battle of Blidworth in which approximately 200 stormtroopers, police, so-called, had gone into the village and occupied the village and marched up and down the streets. And it was a standing army. And Paul was writing in his column in the Mirror in ways that nobody else was writing during the miners' strike of what was actually happening. But because he was equipped with such an extraordinary, profound political overview of the society in which we lived, I wasn't at all sure that the crumbs I might take him would be of any interest. But he had an endless appetite for the detail. He had the extraordinary overview and reach into knowledge and wisdom through which he saw everything. But he loved the detail. He was hungry for it. And
get a hearing aid.
No. I'm so sorry. Has anyone heard anything?
Yes.
Well, I'm sorry to the person. I will try to talk louder. It is a personal impediment that I was born with. It's useful sometimes to get into police stations, but otherwise it's useful. But what John and Darcus have talked about was the extraordinary mix of humour and intelligence and also irony, and then coming in with a punch at the end with just, this was war. He was a warrior, and he wanted ammunition to fight his war. And so whatever one could tell him, he would say, this is marvellous, this is wonderful, very good. I can hear his voice in my head saying, very good, very good. The worse it got, very good. And he
that was
he relished the stupidities of the state, the falsifications of the state, the pomposity of the state. He knew exactly how to puncture it. And the case that most fitted what he could use was a case of two young Palestinians convicted wrongly of bombing the Israeli embassy. And he was a problematic person to deal with in the sense that you were never quite sure how naively you could state what you talked to him about. But he was very forgiving. So he'd say, why do you think those two people are innocent? And you say, well, because they told me so. He'd say, oh, ridiculous. How could you? But then the next minute, you would hear him speaking at a meeting saying they're completely innocent. but his wonderful, wonderful achievement was to be able to write about 8 examples of human error in which MI5 had lost a warning that the Israeli embassy was going to be bombed. And this had to be disclosed during an appeal. Ex-officer David Shaler blown the whistle and revealed there'd been the warning, and the MI5 officer who'd received it had hidden it in a cupboard, and then that was human error. But then afterwards it wasn't shown to the prosecution, who were prosecuting these two young people, and so it went on, and he wrote a series of articles. He wouldn't let it go about this new disease, worse than, what was mad cow disease, whatever it was called, worse than mad cow disease, human error. And then he went on and on and on. But if someone like Pam Dix talked to him about Lockerbie and said help, or if you talked to him about Blidworth or about Samar Alami and Jawad Botmi, he took on a responsibility. He felt responsible. He would wake up each day thinking he had to do something about that case as well as about the world. And that was an extraordinary burden that he carried. It must have been a heavy burden to carry. And the last time I heard his voice was after he died. Just shortly after I heard he died, he had left a message on my telephone about Samar Alami and Jawad Botmi. What should be done? Something had to be done. We had to do something. He was just so extraordinary. I hadn't known he had studied law. I hadn't known that. I know there was an element of interest in the law because he used to tell me endlessly about his son. Had I ever heard him speak about his son Matt? Did I ever mention Matt to you? Well,
don't blush, Matt.
Did I know what amazing work Matt was doing? Well, I didn't at the time, but I've come to now. And Matt is an extraordinary lawyer, but one can't have everything. But just thinking, if he'd been an advocate within the law, he was an advocate in life, he was an advocate in society, and we were so lucky. But he would never, ever, ever have lost a case.
Matt.
I better just put the record straight on Tamara and that romance when we were 10. I have to be careful because my kids are up there. She used to show me copies of Race Today, and I used to show her copies of Socialist Workers. Just a couple of memories about Paul as a journalist growing up. You'd hear in the front room the click-clack of the typewriter. And one of the things I think that was remarkable about him is that the majority of his work was written on a typewriter, no backspace. And I think that helps make you get it right first time. It may have accounted for some of the quality of his journalism, and we had to stay out of the front room when you could hear the click-clack, which we often didn't abide by that rule. The other thing was being surrounded by papers all the time, because he had to read all the press, and every now and then you'd hear this "bugger it," and it was someone had stolen one of his stories. And every now and then you'd hear him chuckling away and say, "This is good stuff, this is good stuff," and you'd catch him. Me and my brother John would catch him. He'd be reading his own stuff. I just wanted to tell another personal story. There's a story really about how brave he was as a journalist as well, which we grew up with. I don't know if we can get the thing up on the screen. Is it possible?
Running around.
Well, I'll start the story. I mean, when me and my brother John were 6 or 7, we were taken around the kitchen table, and Paul said to us, "I'm afraid I may be going to prison, and I have to tell you this." And so we didn't really understand much about the story, but I don't know if we get the still up, maybe we can't. Okay. Okay. Anyway, I wrote a letter to Paul, which you won't be able to decipher, so I'll tell it to you. But it says, "Dear Paul Footy, I'm going to give you a bet that you won't go to prison, 10p, the amount of money you will have to give me if I win." There was a funny picture. That's supposed to be him, as you can obviously tell. And what happened, there's the case, I don't know the case that well, but it was a Janie Jones case where he, as editor of Socialist Worker, had named a witness in that case who was anonymised under the contempt laws, and he had named them in the Socialist Worker and was so taken to court. And there he is walking to the Old Bailey with my stepmom Rose, who sadly died earlier this year. And the other person there is Geoffrey Byman of Byman Solicitors. And he managed to get sort of decent, posh lawyers, and they ran, I think it's a pretty incomprehensible argument, but they ran an argument that the contempt didn't really exist as a law at all. I think the sort of absurdity of the argument possibly helped me to win my bet. He was convicted, though. He always had that conviction for contempt and received a heavy fine. And I just think I'll just finish on this, which is the end of the judgment, I think just sums up Paul. This is Lord Widgery. We've given this matter the best consideration we can on the information available to us. We do not overlook the fact that this case has ventilated a somewhat dark corner of the law of contempt, but we feel bound to recognise the fact that Mr. Foote acted recklessly in this matter. And furthermore, we cannot fail to notice that there has not been a word of withdrawal or apology through the entire proceedings.
I'm going to call some speakers from the floor now. We've had a whole range of subjects there. And I'm going to call people in twos so that we don't delay too much. But the first two people I'd like to call are Michael Hanratty, who is the brother of James Hanratty, and Breeder Power. Is Breeder here?
To my parents, Paul was their rock. They were very down after the execution. And Paul come, and he picked him up, said, "Come on, I'll show you how it's done." He selected a committee, they done all that, and went round the country, giving lectures and that. Paul was brilliant. Paul is a great person. He was a great journalist, and he was very warm. He's one of the nicest persons I ever met. Sorry. But he looked after my parents for about 40 years. I couldn't handle it. I was too young. But he was a terrific guy, very warm. And when my father was dying, he sat with him for a week, every evening, from work, till he died. Okay. Sorry, I'm not very good at speaking, but I get too soft. But I'd like to lighten it a bit fucking people who knew Paul. He was in private eye one day, and the telephone rang, and he said, "This is private eye. It's Paul." Anybody who knew Paul would see the funny side of it. So he said, "This is John." So he said, "Who?" He said, "It's John Lennon." He said, "Will you effing get off the phone? I've got a paper to get out." Put the phone down, and John Lennon rang him up again. So, but the way Paul told me, he was terrific at telling the tale, you know. So then he said, "All right, well, mate," he rang again, and he said, "All right, well, I don't know how he found out it was the real Lennon, but he arranged for him to come round to Private Eye, and when he did, Paul took him out for lunch. Walked into the restaurant, I don't know if it was a Chinese or what, but the waitress collapsed. When she saw John Lennon, she clapped, fainted. And I can't tell a story like Paul did. No, if you knew Paul, he could, if he was telling you anything, he'd take off the voices, like the first gentleman said. He'd do all the voices. No, it was very, but I mean, I think if my father was alive today, he would have loved to come. That's it.
Ian Mitchell and Steve Hamill to come down. We've mentioned the miners' strike, and are they here? Gareth mentioned the miners' strike. It's a theme running through this Marxism because it's 30 years since the miners' strike, and you were both miners at Silverwood Colliery, I believe.
I will call the wizard's apprentice.
Two minutes each. Yeah, well, don't waste your time deciding who's going to go first.
Well, yeah, 30 years ago, I'll be 24 years old. And obviously, when the strike broke out, I became heavily involved in it. And I remember, you know, at the time, obviously in terms of the media, I mean, we used to go around and talk about the press. Well, at first 2 weeks at Silverwood Pit, we spent all this time going round at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to news agents around the villages, picking up the Sun and burning them in a brazier. Apart from the fact that we thought we were doing a service to the local working class, it kept us warm. Now, we wouldn't have done that to the Daily Mirror because we had too much respect for John Pilger and Paul Foot. Now, I went to, the first time I come, well, I knew about Paul Foot because my dad was a steel worker. And my dad were involved at various times in being a shop steward in various jobs that he were involved in. And he bought the Mirror because of John Pilger and because of Paul Foot. And so he used to quote Paul Foot at you, you know, it's like, you'd be trying to watch something, have no interest in it, my dad would be going on about what Paul Foot's saying this week. Now, the first time I heard Paul Foot speak were in very early on in the strike, when I got taken over by Steve, and there were a group of us went over to Manchester, and the comrades in Manchester done an amazing job taking us on solidarity work around Manchester, different workplaces, and we come back with a small fortune. And this, for us, was just amazing because, you know, you were continually being told, including by some people in your own union, that other workers wouldn't support us. And here we were, being taken around these workplaces and people welcoming us, telling us how much they supported us, encouraging us to keep fighting. And then I went to that rally that night, and there were Paul Foot and Tony Cliff speaking, and I was just blown away by both speakers. You know, Foot, that was at the beginning of the strike, but at the end of the strike, I remember things were getting pretty desperate, and we were fighting. When Gareth talks about Blidworth, we can put a lot of other names of villages and communities, including my own, Silverwood, which were Thrivers, Sunnyside, where we all had our own riot. So the police came in and occupied and rioted, went on the riot and tried to beat and bludgeon us back to work. You were desperate for friends, you were desperate for solidarity. Paul Foot did meetings throughout the South Yorkshire coalfields, including Rotherham, which helped to stiffen the resolve of people. And he had plenty of time, always had time for folk. And it's funny when Matt put that up about Paul Footy. Everybody called him Footy. Once you've been to see Paul Foot, it weren't Paul Foot anymore, it was Footy. Miners used to describe him as Footy. It's a footy rally. Are you coming along to it? And also, just finally, because Steve obviously wants to say something, but just finally, Renn, again, Paul Foot knew which side he was on. When it come to, in 1990, when there were a witch hunt against Scargill, led by the likes of Maxwell, again, there were a lot of vacillation. I remember being involved in ringing round, getting people to sign up and supporting. And even Dennis Skinner were umming and ahhing about, you know, which way should we jump. But not Footy, not Paul Foot. Paul Foot agreed to stand with Arthur Scargill and Peter Heathfield, and again we organised quite a big rally in Sheffield. And because of the likes of Foot were involved in it and writing about it and supporting Scargill, that stiffened the backbone of the likes of Skinner, who were on that. I remember being on that platform, and I was sat there thinking, this is the same guy who were vacillating. Now he's acting as if he's leading it. Fair dues, because you need that type of unity. But having the likes of Paul Foot involved always won other people over. It got to other parts that sometimes we couldn't reach. And just lastly, when I was at the Manchester rally, Steve had been trying to get me to join the SWP for a good few years. He failed. But that night at the Footy rally, I joined. And if you're not a member, please consider doing the same.
Ian. Paul Foot, absolutely inspirational. That's how I used to find him. And every time I come into contact with him, he's always wanted to know what were going off. You know, there were no, I'm Paul Foot kind of thing up here, and you're down there. You were the important person in that conversation. And he'd speak to you like that, and he'd let you know all the time. But more than that, his politics shone through. In fact, he was that good. Every time I stood up on a platform, I used to use his words, his phrases. He used to tell this story about how we as miners forced a Tory minister, I think when he's 72, to turn around and tell his children at Christmas that this is probably the last Christmas you're ever going to have. And of course, he'd done mannerisms, etc., as has been alluded to. I remember chairing meetings because for the whole period before the 84 strike through 70s, he was always there, whether or not it was Shrewsbury workers, etc., standing on platforms, right, defending class, arguing what we needed, and that, you know, that commanded respect. You'd go out then and use information he'd provided you with. So constantly, it was theory and practice with Paul, constantly. I really enjoyed times I had to chair meetings with him, and it would always with Cliffy, Tony Cliff, right? They were like Nick and Nike. They were like a stage act that used to come on. But like he'd come up, there was one meeting in Sheffield where Paul was the first one to come up and say, I've really something important to say tonight, Stephen. And I'd say, yes, Paul. And so, like, keep Clifford at clock. You know, don't let him run over. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to stop Cliffy speaking. Me, a lonely miner, Tony Cliff, oh my God, how am I going to do this? But then, right, Paul had walked off that platform, right, and sat down, Tony Cliff comes along, in my ear roll, keep Paul's contribution as short as you possibly can. Well, what do? I let them both have their own heads. That's what I did. It ended up being a great meeting. I remember Paul doing a meeting on Louise Michel at Skegness, right, a revolutionary from the French Revolution and the Paris Commune, etc. And I'd never heard of her. Nobody meeting had heard of this individual, but he'd been asked to do something at a meeting, told nobody, not discussed it with anybody, and he introduces Louise Michel to us. And after a space of 20 minutes, you know, it got you on edge of your seats. It brought this person back from history. It saved her from history. He said, in researching this, it was like scratching around, like a chicken scratching around, you know, in a farmyard to get the bits of information that brought out this heroine of the revolution to all, and in such terms that we all understood it. From that day on, it was a measure of talking to Paul as a comrade, but also being absolutely privileged for him to remember my name, let alone anything else. It was a revolutionary first, second, third, and if there were anything left over, it was a journalist. It was an absolutely wonderful individual and a magnificent revolutionary. That's how I remember Paul Foot.
Many of us can remember those fabulous meetings, and Paul would often speak about Shelley. So I'd like Dave Clinch to come down and Lewis Nielsen. And I've called Lewis because Lewis is like my son. He was one of those children who Paul tried to bribe. £100, quite a lot of money, to learn the whole of the Mask of Anarchy. I think Nick, my son, got as far as verse 10. I think he got a tenner for it as well. But Dave is somebody who did learn the whole of the Mask of Anarchy, and many of you will recognise him. So, Dave.
Thank you. Paul Foot looms large in my life, not least for a day in April 1987 when I was at a meeting of his at Goldsmiths College, and I had no arguments left. I joined the party, and here I am. Going back a bit earlier than that, though, my family had come from Ireland, from Dublin, in the 1950s. I came here as a 6-year-old in 1957, and we used to go to various places in London. When I was a bit older, I remember going up to Hyde Park Corner. It was in the 60s, and I can remember seeing somebody, I believe it was Paul Foot, it may not have been, but he was talking about James Hanratty and the terrible injustice that had been done and still hasn't been sorted out to this day. So that is another memory of mine. And then I'll take you to the Marxism of 1998, when over at the Royal National Hotel there, Paul Foot did the most fantastic meeting on the Mask of Anarchy, Shelley. I'd known a bit about Shelley from university study on the Open University and so on, but Paul Foot just read the whole of The Mask of Anarchy after giving us a prelude to what it was about and what we should look out for. And the contributions after that still are in my mind as one of the best meetings I remember in all the Marxisms I've been to. And he, sadly, I heard about his death on his way to Ireland, to Dublin, my hometown, to meet an old comrade of mine as well now, Paul O'Brien. And I wondered what to do about it, because we were in a bit of shock. And after a while I decided I'm going to learn that bloody poem, because I'd heard about him talking about his children having to learn great tracks from it anyway. So I did. It took me 2 years. I used to drive to school in Ilfracombe, where I was then teaching. I taught in London for 20 years, but I was then teaching in Ilfracombe, and I was going back and forward on a 25-mile journey, and I managed to learn the whole poem in that time, bit by bit. And I first performed it on September 2006 at the Plough Arts Centre in Torrington, and I did it as a benefit for the Raytheon 9. And from then on, I've done it in many places since. I'm not going on about me doing it. I'm just saying the places I've done it because it is important. Tolpuddle in Dublin, also Marxism here. But I'm going to leave you with this. Most importantly, in many ways for me, I did it in Derry. I was invited over there by comrades in Derry. And if you walk around the museum for Bloody Sunday, which I did, it was the 40th anniversary, and there, at the very end, out of all the exhibits and the terrible things that we're being told about, there is this final piece with the words, "Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." And I always end my performances, because I do it with an accompanying slideshow, I always end with that, and a picture of Paul Foote comes up straight after. All the performances, all for benefits, and they're all dedicated to Paul Foote. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry to admit, I did actually initially agree to learn The Mask of Anarchy, but then I saw how long the 100 verses were and gave up immediately. But I think my favourite memory of Paul really was watching Test cricket with him, and watching a particular memory really stands out, and it was watching the West Indies versus England series in the early 2000s. Now this was a pretty awful West Indies team, and they actually got quite smashed by England. I think it was 4-0. But one thing that Paul really instilled in me was a real commitment to supporting the West Indies over England. And it wasn't just because they were the underdog. It was because this was the former colony really smashing the former colonial masters. And he used to describe what pleasure he took in the 70s and 80s and 90s when the West Indies were a great team and used to really smash England all over the park. So that's one thing I remember about Paul. But I think really the biggest influence of Paul on me is the same influence that he'll have on everyone in this room, which is through his work. And whether it's his books or his pamphlets or the CDs and tapes of his speeches, one thing that really shone through from those was Paul's ability to make revolutionary politics and socialist politics accessible and understandable for ordinary people. And this is despite the fact that he has a posher voice than my dad, Paul Holbrook. But I think that's important, because more than that, through all of Paul's work, what really shines through is the way he twinned theory and practice. And he really pushes forward an understanding that we don't just understand the world, we also try to change it. And, you know, in my experience at Sussex University, when I'm arguing with people about revolutionary politics, one of the first things I always give them to read is Paul Foote's Why You Should Be a Socialist, because it's clear and it's concise and anyone can read it and understand. And it makes socialist politics seem like the most simplest and easiest thing in the world to understand. And so I think that when we're remembering Paul and when we're remembering his work and his campaigns, it's important that my generation and our generation not only just remember and celebrate his life, but understand that it wasn't just because Paul was a unique individual, it was more than that. It's because he had a party behind him that was rooted in the working class and that understood the need to seriously fight all forms of oppression and exploitation. So the best testament we can pay to Paul is to build that party and continue the fight that he did throughout his life.
I'd like to ask Paul O'Brien to come to the mic because Dave mentioned Paul. Paul's a member of our organisation in Ireland and often worked on a number of stories with Paul.
Thank you. I first came across Paul Foot in around 1969-1970 on a programme on television, a debate with Dennis Healy on the question of reform or revolution. And by the end of the programme, poor old Dennis Healy was having a hard time. And so he resorted to that age-old trick of insulting his opponent. He said, look, I'm not going to take any lessons from you. I knew poverty as a young man. My father was a miner. You're from a wealthy family, privilege, public school, Oxford. And Paul said to him, you're absolutely right. He said, but you know, we have one thing in common. We're both traitors to our own class. And traitor he was. For over 40 years, 50 years, Paul Foot lacerated the ruling class for their hypocrisy, for the way that they treated humankind. I just want to say a few words about Paul as a writer. People have spoken about him as a great public speaker, and he was that. But his books live on, and I think will always live on, as long as there are socialists. He was a wonderful stylist. I think he wrote in the tradition of Jonathan Swift and George Orwell. He had Swift's, the way he used Swift's satire and humour allied to Orwell's clarity. He never patronized his readers. He wrote in the same way, whether he was writing for the Daily Mirror, Socialist Worker, or The Guardian. If you look at his work, I think it's wonderful the way he avoids. He makes his arguments he avoids abstractions. There's a brevity and opaqueness in everything that he wrote. And I think more than anything else, if you look at his style as a writer, what I think distinguishes him from so many other writers of his time was that he let the meaning choose the word in order to get his point over. And I think that's what he shared with George Orwell. Paul was a socialist because he hated poverty and oppression. But he also, I think, became a socialist because he wanted everybody, not just the elite in this country, to have books, poetry, and art in their lives. That was a huge part of his world. He hated the way that academics had created barriers to the great writers like Shelley and Orwell, Dickens, Wordsworth, Shakespeare. And I think he did more than anyone else to make those writers part of our vocabulary again. I think when we look back on Paul Foot, I can say his legacy for me was twofold. One, he changed the way that we write. He changed the way that we approach socialist propaganda and writing. He hated the way some socialists shouted at people, the crassness and sectarianism that dominated so much of the left. And I think that's what he changed during his lifetime. And that's a huge legacy that we can draw on. And the other legacy he's left us are the books. I think nobody put the case for socialism better than Paul Foot. Whether he was writing in Red Shelley or The Vote, the case for socialism cries out from the pages of those books. So go out to the bookshop, buy his books, and enjoy one of the great writers in the socialist tradition.
Paul used to say about the sort of journalism he wrote, particularly when he was at the Mirror, was that he got a lot of his stories through people in the SWP because they were in contact with ordinary people. And Phil wanted to talk about that, I think.
You don't get much more ordinary than me. I was going to say something else first of all, but I was telling Paul Foot speechless, which is unusual. First time I saw him was at a big meeting in the early 70s in Bristol. Shepherd's Hall, 300 people or so, and there's a strike. And there was a striking print worker on the platform, and Paul Foot was late because his train was late, and he comes in, and we're all in anticipation, and the chair says, Right, we're going to hear from the striking speaker and the striking print worker. And the print worker gets up and says, "The Tories are fucking bastards and we've got to get rid of the fuckers," and sits down. and that was his contribution. And Paul Foot was and he was speechless for all of 10 or 15 seconds. And then he said, "Well, you can't argue with that, can you?" And then he went on to make a brilliant speech. But what I was really, they were anticipating I was going to say was that when you're a dad, and my kids are grown up now, I've got loads of grandchildren, when you're a dad, you go to school and to parents' evening, and the teacher said to me when my son was about 7, "Your son has got a real strong sense of justice." And you don't know how proud you are when somebody else recognises that. And that's what Paul Foot had, a strong sense of justice. And I was in Gloucester for a long period of time, working as a socialist in Gloucester, and any campaigns that came up, anybody who had some injustice, you find out about it. And Paul Foot, I always used to work with Paul. I didn't give him stories, he took them up. If you talk about the injustices, he would take them up. And all the friends that I had when, in Gloucester would buy the Mirror, or they'd buy the Guardian, or buy Socialist Workers Party. Whenever he was in it, they turned to his column, what it was, because he had a strong sense of justice. They wanted to read about the injustices and the stories that were revealing the corruption and all the other things that were going on. And Paul, I remember one in particular, I could go on for ages, but one in particular was a guy called Richard Hill. I'd never met him, I still haven't ever met him, but the word on the street was he'd been fitted up by the cops. And he was accused of stabbing a copper. So I went to see his mum, and she was a very resilient and tough woman, wanted something done. So we set up a campaign, and the kids on the street, I was not very old myself then, but the kids on the street were, "Richard Hill is innocent." Some of those slogans are still up on the railway bridges in Gloucester, I believe, they were. And Paul took it up, and like somebody, I think it was Gareth saying, the more he got into it, the more enthusiastic he got. And on that case, we got a solicitor involved, Paul was involved. I think he told me at the time it's the only time he'd ever devoted the whole of his Mirror column to a case, was the Richard Hill one. And of course, Richard Hill, as a result of not just Paul's writing, which was absolutely brilliant and absolutely essential to the campaign, but the campaign on the ground, Richard Hill proved the police, we all proved the police had actually fitted him up and he was innocent. And that's what I remember Paul Foot, strong sense of justice. We've all got one, we'd need another Paul Foot somewhere to take up some of these things.
The last case that Paul wrote about was actually the case of Jawad Bokmi, and Jawad has just arrived. And so he's just going to come and say a couple of words.
Hi. Gareth mentioned the fact that Paul actually worked on our case, and she mentioned how he actually took up the case. I just want to tell you how I felt when I was inside when he took up the case. Having been convicted to 20 years for conspiracy to cause explosion, something we didn't do. Everybody's telling us that we did it, apart from our legal team and ourselves. And then we get convicted to 20 years, and we know that things are wrong, but we don't know how to disentangle all this. Injustice is not unknown to me. I'm a Palestinian, and I lived under occupation for 17 years before I came to this country. So I understood that, but I didn't expect it here, so I was shocked. After conviction, and this was like terminal, that's it, 20 years in prison, and you're a terrorist. So it's, where are we going to go from here? There's no major flaws in the case as far as the appeal is concerned, so what are we going to do? And then Paul Foot's article appears about a miscarriage of justice. I was in despair, and I'm sure my co-defendant somehow was the same. And we felt, oh, so we're not really mad. We didn't do it, and we can say we didn't do it, and we can fight it. That was the moment of hope and sustenance that Paul gave us. And since then, it became apparent, all the cover-ups that they did, and he wrote about the BSC, the human errors, and all these things, and it became apparent how much they covered up. Yet the state doesn't want to admit that they made a mistake. And we ended up doing our sentence. I ended up doing the full 20 years, 2/3 of the 20 years. But I wouldn't have survived 5 minutes after conviction if it wasn't for the hope that I got from Paul. I didn't know Paul. I knew him through his writings before, and even I didn't meet him afterwards because he died before I was released. So, so in a sense, not only, I mean, Paul for me is hope. Apart from his inspiration, is total sustenance to us, and it reached us in the darkest moments and allowed us to carry on. I am standing here totally sane. I would have been totally insane if I had to deal with 15 years imprisonment and no support from outside. The person that made it possible, that opened the floodgates as far as other journalists are concerned, to look into the case was Paul Foot, and his belief in justice was fundamental to that. So I would say, thank you, Paul.
They'd like to come back for a moment or two. John?
I can't really add anything to as appreciative as those testimonies, because that's what those testimonies are, just evidence of what Paul gave in his life, the gift of going into giving people hope in their darkest moments, bringing the whole light of justice on people. There's no greater tribute for Paul. I was just this morning thinking of his perhaps lesser known campaigns. One was quite brief, when he flew off to Lima in Peru at the height of the Falklands War in 1982 and got hold of a document there which showed that the ambassadors of Argentina and Britain were about to sign in secret, this had been going on for quite a long time, a compromise that would have almost certainly have stopped the fighting in the Falklands and perhaps even led to the kind of settlement that would have taken the Falklands, Malvinas off the agenda. It would have almost certainly ended the war. And before this, Paul published this, but just before he published it, Thatcher did nothing to stop an order that went out to a Royal Navy submarine which sank the Argentine cruiser Belgrano. Paul provided the proof in his story, and I think it ran in the Mirror, that this was a wholly willful act, the killing of all those young conscripted soldiers on the Belgrano, and that the whole war could have ended much earlier. It was an extraordinary piece of investigative journalism that didn't stop the war, but it gave us that kind of enlightenment about how ruthless great power is, an imperial great power, when it wants to be. It was Paul at his finest. Thank you.
I'll just recite the last two lines of Shakespeare's sonnet number 20. If the wild I think on Paul, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end.
Just recently I had to drive at night when I was tired, and it was a long way and I wasn't sure if I could keep awake. And I had in the car Paul's lectures, a number of CDs. And they carried me through, and they were extraordinary, educative, thrilling, inspirational, wonderful. And so we're lucky to have known him, and we're lucky to have what he left for us. It is absolutely extraordinary. Yeah. He is an extraordinary person, an extraordinary person.
Just finish on this thing. He was a slightly better speaker and a writer than he was with IT. And I can't resist telling the joke again, but he famously said to Claire, his partner, looking at the facts bemused, "How does the paper get down the wire?" But I think I just agree with Gareth, and if you're going to take one, if you haven't heard it and you're going to get one thing, I really recommend the speech on Toussaint. Is my favourite, the Toussaint Louverture speech, because his description there of the general fleeing the slave revolt from his toilet is the funniest. It makes me laugh every single time, and I really recommend you get that on the way out. Thank you for coming.